Hey, welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy tonight's stories. Here we venture into the dark web, peeling back layers of mystery and terror to reveal tales that were never meant to be told. Leave a like and subscribe for more dark web scary stories. I bought a protective talisman from the dark web. Now I'm seeing creatures lurking just outside my door. I'll admit it, I've always been a little too curious for my own good. I'm the kind of person who watches hours of dark web horror stories on YouTube at 2 a.m, even though I know they'll keep me up all night. Most of the time I tell myself it's all fake, just stories to scare people. But part of me always wondered, what if some of it is real? A few weeks ago, I found out. It started on one of those sleepless nights. I was scrolling through some forum, don't ask me which one, I couldn't tell you now, and someone posted a link to a website that claimed to sell protective talismans. The post was vague, but the comments were full of people swearing by it. "It saved my life," one person wrote. "If you're dealing with anything supernatural, you need this." Most of the comments seemed like trolls, but a few of them, I don't know, they felt different. Almost desperate. I wasn't dealing with anything supernatural, at least not yet. But I'd been in a weird headspace lately. Work was stressing me out, my apartment felt too quiet, and I couldn't shake this feeling like something was off. You know that sensation when you're sure someone's watching you, even though you're alone? I'd been feeling that for days. So, against my better judgment, I clicked the link. The website was simple, too simple, just a black background with a handful of items listed, no descriptions, no reviews, no FAQ. Most of the listings were for things like binding rituals and banishment spells, stuff I didn't even pretend to understand. But near the bottom of the page, there it was. Protective talisman, custom crafted for your needs. I hesitated for a long time before clicking on it. The page that loaded was even sketchier. It asked for my name, my address, and, get this, a short description of the threats you're facing. It didn't explain what that meant. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, I typed, "Feeling watched. Weird noises at night. Need protection." I don't know why I sent it. Maybe I thought nothing would happen. Maybe I just wanted to see what would come of it. Either way, I hit submit, and the page instantly refreshed with a message. Your talisman is being crafted. It will arrive in 3 to 5 days. No confirmation email, no payment screen, nothing. I closed my laptop and tried to forget about it. I figured it was just some elaborate prank, one of those fake websites made to mess with people. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just done something incredibly stupid. 3 days later, the package showed up. It was small, just a plain brown envelope with no return address. My name and address were scrawled on the front in handwriting so messy it was barely legible. Inside was a single object wrapped in black cloth. When I unwrapped it, I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it definitely wasn't this. The talisman was small, about the size of my palm, and made of some kind of dark, rough stone. It was carved into a strange, jagged shape that didn't look like anything I recognized. Around the edges there were tiny, intricate symbols etched into the surface, almost too faint to see. There was no note, no instructions, just the talisman. I turned it over in my hands, trying to decide if I'd just wasted my time or if this was the start of some ridiculous scam. But, as I held it, a strange sensation washed over me. It was subtle, like the air in the room had shifted. Lighter, maybe. Easier to breathe. I told myself it was just my imagination. I mean, it had to be, right? That night, things started happening. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something tapping on my bedroom window. My apartment's on the second floor, and there's nothing outside that window but a sheer drop to the alley below. I stayed frozen in bed, listening, my heart racing. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone or something was out there trying to get my attention. After what felt like hours, the tapping stopped. I didn't dare move until the sun came up. When I finally worked up the nerve to check, there was nothing outside. No footprints on the ledge, no marks on the glass, just an empty alley. The next few days were worse. I started hearing noises in the apartment. Low creaks and groans like the kind you'd expect from an old house. But my building isn't old. It's one of those soulless modern complexes that was thrown together as quickly and cheaply as possible. The walls shouldn't be making those sounds. And then there were the shadows. At first, I thought I was imagining them. Quick flickers in the corners of my vision, gone as soon as I turned my head. But one night, as I was walking back from the kitchen, I saw one move. Not out of the corner of my eye. Right in front of me. It was tall, too tall, its head brushing the ceiling, and impossibly thin, like its limbs had been stretched beyond what was natural. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless surface where one should have been. I froze, clutching the talisman in my hand, so hard it dug into my skin. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, silent and still, blocking the hallway. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I haven't told anyone about this. Who would believe me? I don't even know if I believe me. All I know is, ever since I got that talisman, things have been getting worse. I haven't thrown it away. I can't. Every time I think about getting rid of it, I get this overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible will happen if I let it go. But now, every night, I hear them. The tapping on the windows, the creaks in the walls. And sometimes, if I'm very quiet, I can hear them whispering. They're waiting. After that first encounter, things escalated fast. It wasn't just the tapping or the shadows anymore. It was everything. The apartment itself felt wrong. The air was heavier, colder, even during the day. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. I started carrying the talisman with me everywhere. I didn't even think about it. It just felt right to keep it close. Every time I held it, I felt this faint, buzzing sensation in my hand, like holding a live wire. I convinced myself it was protecting me. I mean, it had to be. What else was I supposed to believe? The whispers started a few nights later. At first, I thought it was coming from the hallway outside my apartment. My neighbors can be loud sometimes, arguing, playing music at weird hours, but this was different. The sound wasn't muffled or distant. It was close, too close. It started as faint murmurs, words I couldn't quite make out. I figured it was just my imagination or maybe the building settling, but then it grew louder, clearer, like someone was speaking directly into my ear. "It's watching you." I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet, but no one was there. Just the empty room, bathed in the faint glow of the streetlights outside. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound got caught in my throat. And then it happened again. "Don't let it in." This time it was coming from the living room. I grabbed a kitchen knife, not that I thought it would help, and crept toward the sound, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop. When I reached the living room, it was empty, but the front door was open. I know what you're thinking. How does a door just open on its own? I thought the same thing. My first instinct was to blame the lock. Maybe it was faulty, or maybe I'd forgotten to latch it properly. But when I went to close it, I realized something that sent a shiver down my spine. The deadbolt was still locked. The door had opened with the lock still engaged. I slammed it shut and slid the chain across, triple-checking to make sure it was secure. Then I pushed a chair in front of it for good measure. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on the knife. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every sound, every flicker of movement sent me into a full-blown panic. By morning, I was exhausted. I'd spent hours sitting in the corner of the living room, clutching the talisman like it was a lifeline. When the first light of dawn spilled through the windows, I felt a brief wave of relief, like I'd made it through something I couldn't even name. But the relief didn't last. The next day, I decided I needed answers. I went back to the website, hoping it would have some kind of contact info, a phone number, an email address, anything. But when I tried to load the page, I got a 404 error, gone like it had never existed. I tried searching for it, digging through my browser history, even looking up the forums where I'd first found the link. Nothing. It was like the entire thing had been scrubbed from the internet. That's when I started to panic. If I couldn't contact the seller, how was I supposed to figure out what this thing was? Or how to stop whatever was happening to me? I spent hours searching for anything remotely similar. A talisman with strange symbols, supernatural experiences tied to the dark web. But everything I found was either vague or contradictory. Some people said talismans were inherently protective, that they warded off evil. Others claimed they could act as a beacon, drawing spirits or entities toward the person carrying them. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that ever since the talisman arrived, my life had turned into a waking nightmare. That night, the whispers came back. Louder this time, more insistent. Don't look at it. It's inside. You brought it here. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside, they were in my head. I could feel them, crawling through my mind like spiders, leaving behind trails of fear and doubt. I tried to focus on the talisman, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. "You're supposed to protect me," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Why aren't you protecting me?" The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was so complete it felt unnatural, like the entire world had paused, holding its breath. And then I heard it, a single knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tap, like someone was politely asking to be let in. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. My apartment was on the second floor, and the front door opened into a locked hallway. No one should have been able to get in without a key. The knock came again, louder this time. I stood up, the talisman still clutched in my hand, and took a shaky step toward the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but some sick part of me needed to know who or what was on the other side. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the chain, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. But before I could decide, the knock came again, this time so loud it rattled the door in its frame. And then a voice, low, gravelly, and completely inhuman. "Let me in." I didn't open the door. I couldn't. My hand hovered over the chain, trembling, but something deep inside me, some primal instinct, screamed that opening it would be the worst mistake of my life. Instead, I backed away step by step until my back hit the far wall of the living room. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the apartment was dead silent. Then, just as I started to think it was over, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the apartment. My blood went cold. I turned, slowly scanning the room, but everything was just as I'd left it. The furniture, the cluttered coffee table, the talisman sitting where I'd dropped it on the couch. Nothing looked out of place, but the sound continued. Faint, rhythmic taps like someone was rapping their knuckles against the walls. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to move, shifting from one corner of the room to another, like whatever was making it didn't want me to find it. And then I realized something horrifying. The taps were coming closer. I grabbed the talisman, clutching it so tightly the edges dug into my palm. It buzzed faintly against my skin, the same strange vibration I'd felt before, but it wasn't comforting anymore. If anything, it felt wrong. Like it wasn't just buzzing, it was pulsing, in time with the tapping. I didn't know what else to do, so I started whispering to it, begging. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "If you're supposed to protect me, do something, stop this." The tapping stopped. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the apartment was completely silent again. No whispers, no knocking, just the faint hum of the fridge and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I almost convinced myself that it was over, that the talisman had worked. And then I saw it. It was standing in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the faint glow of the streetlights outside. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light. But shadows don't move like that. They don't breathe. The thing was tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, and its limbs were impossibly long and thin, like the branches of a dead tree. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was featureless, just a smooth, pale surface that reflected the dim light in strange, unsettling ways. It didn't make a sound, it didn't move, it just stood there, watching me. Or maybe not watching, how could it without eyes? But I could feel its attention, heavy and suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so intense it felt like my mind was tearing itself apart. The talisman buzzed harder in my hand, the vibrations so strong now they almost hurt. And then, to my horror, the thing moved. It didn't walk exactly, it just shifted. One moment it was in the corner, and the next it was closer, its long, spindly limbs stretching unnaturally as it closed the distance between us. "Let me in," it rasped, its voice low and guttural, like the sound of gravel grinding together. I shook my head, clutching the talisman like it was the only thing keeping me alive. "No," I whispered, "you can't come in." The thing tilted its head, its featureless face somehow managing to convey a sense of mockery. "You already did," it said. "When you called for me." Called for it? I didn't know what it was talking about. I hadn't called for anything. I just bought the talisman, thinking it would protect me. But as the thing took another step closer, I realized the truth. The talisman hadn't protected me. It had summoned this thing. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." "Lies," the thing hissed, cutting me off. "You wanted me, and now I'm here." I backed up until I hit the wall, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stay upright. "What do you want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The thing leaned closer, its head tilting to one side, as if it were studying me. "You brought me here," it said. "You opened the door. And now—" Its voice trailed off, but I didn't need it to finish the sentence. I already knew what it wanted. "Mister, I don't know where I found the strength, but I forced myself to move. I bolted for the door, yanking the chain off and fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking so badly it felt like an eternity before I finally got it open. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran. I don't remember much about that night, just the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the empty streets, the cold air burning my lungs and the overwhelming sense that something was following me. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, too exhausted to take another step. When I finally collapsed on a bench in some unfamiliar park, I realized I was still holding the talisman. Its buzzing had stopped, but it felt heavier now, like it was weighing me down. I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. The same feeling of dread I'd had the first time I considered getting rid of it. Like letting go of it would only make things worse. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know if I'll ever be safe again. But I do know one thing. Whatever I let in, it isn't done with me yet. I didn't go home. I couldn't. After running as far as my legs would take me, I ended up at a 24-hour diner. It was quiet, mostly empty, with the faint hum of an old jukebox playing some song I didn't recognize. It felt safe, or at least safer than the alternative. I sat in a booth near the back, nursing a cup of coffee I didn't want and couldn't taste. The talisman sat on the table in front of me, its jagged surface catching the dim light. For the first time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The symbols etched into it seemed to have changed. They were sharper now, more defined, almost glowing faintly. I wanted to throw it away, to smash it into pieces and leave it behind, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about it felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Around 3 a.m. I noticed the first one. A man in a black coat had been standing outside the diner for what felt like hours. At first, I thought he was just a homeless guy or someone waiting for a ride, but something about him was off. He wasn't moving, not even a little, just standing there, perfectly still, facing the window, but not looking in. I tried to ignore him, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I noticed another figure across the street, a woman this time, standing under a flickering streetlight. She was just as still, her head tilted slightly to one side, her face hidden in shadow. And then another, and another. They were everywhere, at least a dozen figures scattered across the parking lot and sidewalks, all perfectly still, all facing the diner. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow. I tried to tell myself they were just people, but deep down, I knew better. There was something wrong about them, something unnatural. I glanced around the diner, hoping someone else had noticed, but the only other people there were an older couple in the corner, half asleep over their food, and the waitress behind the counter, too busy scrolling through her phone to pay attention. When I looked back out the window, the figures were closer. I grabbed the talisman, shoving it into my jacket pocket as I slid out of the booth. My first instinct was to leave, but as soon as I reached the door, I stopped. The man in the black coat was standing directly outside now, his head turned slightly as if he was looking at me. But he didn't have a face. There was nothing there. Just smooth, pale skin where his features should have been. I stumbled back, my hand flying to the talisman in my pocket. The buzzing sensation was stronger now, almost painful, like it was reacting to whatever was outside. The man didn't move, but I felt his attention, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" No response. The figures outside didn't move, but the shadows around them seemed to shift, stretching toward the diner like they were alive. I backed away, my heart racing, and turned toward the counter. The waitress was gone. I don't know how I missed it, but the diner was empty now. The couple in the corner, gone. The waitress, gone. Even the hum of the jukebox had stopped, leaving the place eerily silent. I was alone. And then the lights flickered. It started as a faint buzzing sound, almost like static, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. One of the figures was inside the diner now, standing at the far end of the room near the kitchen door. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound, but I knew it was watching me. The buzzing in my pocket grew louder, almost deafening, and the talisman felt like it was burning against my skin. I pulled it out, holding it up like a weapon, though I had no idea what I was supposed to do with it. "Stay back," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, its faceless void somehow managing to convey a sense of mockery. And then it took a step forward. I panicked. Without thinking, I hurled the talisman at it, the sharp edges glinting in the flickering light. It hit the figure square in the chest, and for a split second, I thought it worked. The thing froze, its body jerking slightly, like it was glitching out. And then it started laughing. The sound wasn't human. It was a low, guttural noise, layered with 1,000 other voices, echoing through the empty diner. The shadows around the figure began to shift and writhe, reaching out like black tendrils. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and bolted for the back door, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The laughter followed me, growing louder and more distorted, until it was all I could hear. When I burst through the door into the cold night air, the figures were waiting for me. They surrounded the alley, their faceless heads tilted toward me, their long, spindly limbs reaching out. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. And then I felt it. The talisman, lying in the middle of the alley where I'd dropped it. It was glowing faintly now, its surface pulsing with a strange, otherworldly light. I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed it and held it up, the buzzing sensation coursing through my entire body. The figures stopped, their shadows recoiling slightly, as if the talisman was keeping them at bay. But I knew it wouldn't last. I don't know how I managed to hold my ground. The figures stood motionless, their shadows swirling around them like living things. The talisman in my hand burned hotter, the strange light pulsing in time with the buzzing in my ears. It felt alive, and for a moment I wondered if it was fighting them or feeding them. I took a shaky step backward, my eyes darting between the faceless figures. They didn't move, but the shadows stretched toward me, inching closer with every passing second. The air was thick with the smell of something metallic and burnt, and I could barely breathe. "You brought this on yourself," a voice rasped. It wasn't coming from any of the figures. It was coming from everywhere, above, below, inside my own head. The words echoed, layered with countless whispers that blended together into a single, suffocating presence. "You opened the door, and now it won't close." I tried to speak, to argue, but my throat was so tight I could barely manage a whisper. "What door?" I croaked. The laughter came again, low and guttural, reverberating through the alley. One of the figures stepped forward, its faceless head tilting as if it were amused. "The talisman," it said, its voice like nails scraping against metal. "You thought it would protect you, but it invited us. It gave us a way in." The buzzing grew louder, almost unbearable, as the talisman pulsed brighter. I looked down at it, my grip tightening, and for the first time I noticed something horrifying. The symbols were moving. They twisted and shifted across the surface of the talisman, rearranging themselves into patterns I couldn't comprehend. The pulsing light grew stronger, casting eerie shadows across the alley. And then I realized something that made my stomach drop. The light wasn't keeping them away. It was calling them closer. I turned and ran, clutching the talisman as I stumbled down the alley. The figures didn't chase me, but their shadows followed, stretching impossibly long, reaching out to snatch at my feet. The laughter echoed in my ears, growing fainter the farther I ran, but the buzzing in the talisman didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more frantic, as if it were trying to warn me or control me. I burst out onto the main street, my chest heaving, my legs burning. The city was eerily quiet, the streetlights flickering above me. There were no cars, no people, just me and the endless, suffocating silence. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the park. The park was dark, the trees casting long, jagged shadows across the empty paths. I collapsed onto a bench, my body trembling, my mind racing. The talisman was still glowing faintly, the symbols shifting like they were alive. I wanted to throw it away, to leave it behind, but something told me it wouldn't matter. It had already done what it was meant to do. "You can't escape," the voice said, louder now, closer. I looked up, and my heart sank. The figures were there, standing at the edge of the park, their faceless heads turned toward me. There were more of them now, dozens, maybe hundreds, stretching out in every direction. Their shadows slithered across the ground like snakes, converging on the bench where I sat. "You opened the door," the voice continued. "And now you must step through." The shadows reached the bench, curling around my legs like cold, clammy hands. I tried to fight, to pull away, but they held me in place, their grip impossibly strong. The talisman buzzed violently in my hand, the light growing brighter, almost blinding. And then I saw it. A doorway. It wasn't there before, just a black, gaping void in the middle of the park, framed by writhing shadows. The figures moved toward it, their long limbs bending and twisting as they disappeared into the darkness one by one. The voice spoke again, louder now, reverberating through my skull. "It's time." The shadows tightened their grip, pulling me toward the doorway. I screamed, clawing at the ground, at the bench, at anything I could reach, but it was useless. The talisman pulsed in my hand, its symbols glowing brighter, faster, until they were a blur of incomprehensible patterns. As I was dragged closer to the doorway, the air grew colder, heavier. I could feel something on the other side, something vast and ancient and hungry. "No!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "I didn't mean to! I didn't know!" The voice laughed, low and cruel. "You don't need to mean it," it said. "You only need to act." The shadows pulled me to the edge of the doorway. The void stretched out before me, endless and empty, but I could feel the weight of it, the presence waiting just beyond the darkness. I clutched the talisman, tears streaming down my face, and whispered one final, desperate plea. "Please, don't let it take me." The talisman buzzed one last time, the light flickering weakly before it shattered in my hand. The shards dissolved into the air, leaving me empty-handed as the shadows dragged me forward. And then I fell. I don't remember hitting the ground. I don't remember anything after that. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, lying on the living room floor. The talisman was gone. The buzzing was gone. The figures were gone. But the door wasn't. It's still there, just outside my bedroom, a faint outline of black, shifting and pulsing like it's alive. I haven't gone near it. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers coming from the other side. They're waiting for me. And I think, eventually, I'll have to let them in. I was paid to watch security footage in a government facility. The footage is of me, and I don't remember filming it. All right, let me start by saying I wasn't looking for anything shady. I'm just a broke 24-year-old trying to keep the lights on and maybe pay off a bit of student debt. So when I found the ad, it didn't immediately scream sketchy. It was on one of those job boards for temp gigs, watch security footage overnight, $25 an hour, no experience necessary. I figured it was some warehouse or office building that needed someone to babysit their cameras. Easy money, right? The ad had this generic contact email, so I shot over a quick response. Within an hour, I got a reply, which was already weird. Companies don't usually move that fast unless they're desperate. The email was brief, just an address, a time, and instructions to bring my ID for verification. No interviews, no questions about experience. That probably should have been my first red flag. But like I said, I was desperate. The place was about a 45-minute drive out of the city, in the middle of nowhere. By the time I got there, it was already dark, and the building looked off. It wasn't one of those sleek corporate offices or even an old warehouse. It was a low, windowless structure made of concrete, surrounded by a high chain-link fence with barbed wire on top. The kind of place you'd drive past without giving it a second thought. I pulled up to the gate, and this guy in a black uniform came out of a small guard shack. He didn't say much, just checked my ID, handed me a visitor's badge, and waved me through. Inside, the place was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the hallways smelled like bleach and stale air. A woman was waiting for me by the reception desk. She introduced herself as Ms. Grant, though her tone made it clear that we weren't on a first-name basis. She was tall, with sharp features, and a no-nonsense attitude. "Thank you for coming on short notice," she said, handing me a clipboard. "Sign here to confirm you've read and agreed to the non-disclosure agreement." I hadn't read anything, but she looked like the kind of person who wouldn't appreciate questions. I scribbled my name on the dotted line, and she nodded, leading me down a series of identical hallways until we reached a heavy metal door with a keypad. "This will be your station for the night," she said, punching in a code. The door clicked open, revealing a small, windowless room with a desk, a single chair, and a wall of monitors. The setup looked dated, old CRT screens, grainy black and white footage. There were no labels or timestamps, just feeds from different cameras showing dimly lit hallways, empty rooms, and what looked like storage areas. "You'll be monitoring these feeds until 6 a.m., Ms. Grant said. "Do not leave the room until your shift is over. If you see anything unusual, press this button." She pointed to a red button on the desk. "What counts as unusual?" I asked. "You'll know," she replied curtly. Before I could press for details, she stepped out and locked the door behind her. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I watched the screens, trying to stay awake while the cameras cycled through static hallways and empty rooms. There was nothing to do, no phone, no Wi-Fi, not even a book. Just me and the monitors. Around midnight, I started to notice something weird. One of the feeds, camera 6, kept glitching. The screen would flicker, showing static for a few seconds, before returning to normal. At first, I figured it was just a technical issue, but then the glitches got longer, and I realized the static wasn't random. It was showing something. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Amid the white noise, I could make out faint shapes, walls, a door, a chair. It almost looked like the room I was sitting in. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "You're just tired," I told myself. "It's a coincidence." But as the static cleared, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Someone was sitting in the chair. My chair. It wasn't clear at first, just a blurry figure hunched over the desk. But as the image sharpened, I recognized the clothes, the posture, the way the figure tapped its fingers against the desk. It was me. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure on the monitor wasn't moving, just sitting there, perfectly still, staring at the wall of screens in front of it. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see, I don't know, a mirror? A prank? But the room was empty, exactly as it should have been. When I looked back at the monitor, the feed had changed. The camera now showed an empty hallway, the same grainy black and white footage as the others. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, a coincidence, maybe even my imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Around 2 a.m., the glitches started again. This time, it wasn't just one monitor, it was all of them. The static came in waves, distorting the footage until the screens were filled with jagged, broken images. Then the static cleared. The feeds were no longer showing hallways or storage rooms, they were showing me. Every screen, every angle, different versions of me sitting at the desk, standing by the door, pacing the room. Each version moved slightly differently, like they were out of sync, but they all had the same blank expression. And then one by one, they turned to look directly at the camera, directly at me. I slammed the red button on the desk, but nothing happened. No alarms, no flashing lights, nothing. The figures on the screens started moving closer, walking toward the cameras as if they could step through the glass. I backed up, my chair scraping against the floor as I pressed myself against the wall. The door suddenly unlocked with a loud click. I didn't think, I just ran. I don't remember much after that. The hallways all looked the same, and I must have taken a dozen wrong turns before I finally found an exit. When I burst through the doors and into the night, the guard at the shack barely glanced at me as I stumbled to my car. I didn't even bother with my seatbelt. I just floored it, leaving the building and its endless hallways behind. But when I got home, something didn't feel right. The house was dark and quiet, just as I'd left it, but there was a faint hum in the air. I followed the sound to my living room, where my TV was on, showing static. And in the static, I saw myself, sitting on the couch, smiling. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those screens, those versions of me turning to stare, moving closer like they could see something I couldn't. By the time morning rolled around, I'd convinced myself it was a stress-induced hallucination. Maybe the monitors were on some kind of delay, and I'd just misunderstood what I was seeing. I wasn't about to go back, though. I emailed Ms. Grant, telling her I wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be able to make my second shift. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with a reply. "Your presence is mandatory. If you fail to report, you will forfeit your payment and breach your contract." My stomach twisted. Breach of contract? What had I even signed? I went back and read the NDA, and my hands started shaking. There were clauses about liability, non-disclosure, and something called a compliance penalty. I didn't know what that meant, but the words were enough to scare me into showing up again. The second night started much like the first. The same guard waved me through the gate, and Ms. Grant was waiting for me with the same clipboard and the same cold demeanor. She didn't ask how I was feeling or why I'd tried to skip the shift. "This is your station," she said again, as she led me back to the room. Her tone was clipped, like she was annoyed I even needed to be reminded. "Remember the rules. Do not leave the room. Notify us if you see anything unusual." This time, though, there was something different in her expression. Something almost nervous. She left before I could ask about it, the heavy door locking behind her. I sat at the desk, staring at the screens. At first, everything was normal. Hallways, empty rooms, and that faint, static-like buzz from the old equipment. I kept glancing at camera 6, half expecting to see myself again, but it showed nothing out of the ordinary. By midnight, I started to relax. Maybe last night had been a fluke, just a trick of the light or a bad dream, the kind of thing you could laugh off in the daylight. But then, just like before, the glitches started. This time, it wasn't static. The monitors flickered, cutting in and out, but the images they showed weren't hallways or storage rooms. They were other people. At first, I thought they were co-workers, employees wandering the facility after hours, but the longer I watched, the more I realized something was wrong. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets being controlled by invisible strings. And then I noticed their faces. They didn't have any. Where their features should have been, there was just smooth, pale skin, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, nothing. I leaned closer to the screens, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The faceless figures wandered aimlessly through the halls, their heads tilting at odd angles like they were listening for something. Then one of them stopped. It turned toward the camera, its blank face staring directly into the lens. The others followed. One by one, they turned to face the cameras, their heads cocking as if they knew I was watching. My pulse raced as I pressed the red button on the desk. This time, there was a response, a sharp beep, followed by a robotic voice over the intercom. "Alert received. Please remain in your station." The figures on the screens began to move, walking in unison toward a single hallway. The same hallway that led to my room. I grabbed the fire poker from beneath the desk, not that it would do much against whatever these things were, and backed up until my shoulders hit the wall. My breathing was loud and ragged, and every second felt like an eternity. The feed on camera 6 suddenly changed. It showed the hallway outside my room. The faceless figures were standing there, perfectly still, just a few feet from the door. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. The door didn't open. Instead, it rattled like someone or something was testing it. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the fire poker so tightly my hands ached. The rattling stopped, and for a moment the room was completely silent, except for the hum of the monitors. Then the lights went out. The monitors stayed on, casting an eerie glow across the room. I could still see the figures on the screen standing in the hallway, but now they were moving. Not toward the door, but toward the cameras. One of them reached out, pressing its featureless face against the lens. The screen flickered, and when the image returned, the hallway was empty. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a presence in the room, heavy and oppressive, like the air had turned to lead. I swung the fire poker wildly, the metal whooshing through empty space. Then in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A reflection on one of the monitors, something standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the monitors, the feeds were different again. They showed the room I was in, but not from the cameras. They showed me. Not the me sitting at the desk, but a version of me standing in the middle of the room, staring blankly at the screens. This version of me lifted its hand and pointed. Slowly, deliberately. It was pointing at the door. Before I could process what was happening, the door unlocked with a loud click. I didn't run this time. I stayed frozen in my chair, staring at the screen as the other version of me turned and walked out into the hallway. And that's when I realized something horrifying. The figure on the screen wasn't leaving. It was coming back, toward me. The door clicked open and I braced myself, gripping the fire poker like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The sound of the hinges creaking felt louder than it should have been, echoing in the small room. I was sweating, shaking, my breath coming out in short, ragged gasps. The hallway outside was empty. I stared at the open door, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the monitors behind me and the heavy, suffocating silence of the hallway. I took a step forward, the fire poker trembling in my hands. My eyes darted between the doorway and the screens. The monitors still showed the same looping footage of me, or whatever that thing was, walking toward the room. I don't know why, but I called out. "Hello?" My voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper. And then, from somewhere down the hall, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. I backed up, nearly tripping over the desk. The fire poker felt useless, like a toy in my hands. The footsteps grew louder, more defined, until they stopped just outside the door. The lights in the hallway flickered and I saw it. It was me, or at least it looked like me. Same clothes, same posture, same face, but the eyes were wrong, glassy, lifeless, like a doll's. It stood in the doorway, staring at me with a vacant expression. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. It didn't answer, it just stood there, tilting its head slightly, as if it were studying me. I stepped back, bumping into the wall. "What do you want?" The thing smiled. Not a friendly smile, but something cold and wrong, like it was trying to mimic an expression it didn't quite understand. And then it spoke. "Do you remember?" Its voice was mine, but hollow, distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Remember what?" I asked, my heart pounding. It didn't answer. Instead, it took a step forward, crossing the threshold into the room. I swung the fire poker instinctively, but it didn't flinch. The metal passed right through it, as if it wasn't even there. The smile widened. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice echoing in my head. Before I could respond, the monitors flickered again. The image on the screens changed, and my stomach dropped. The footage was of me, but not this me. It showed me sitting in a different room, one I didn't recognize. The walls were bare concrete, the lighting dim and harsh. I was strapped to a chair, my head lolling to one side like I was unconscious. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The thing in front of me didn't answer. Instead, it pointed to the monitors. "Watch," it said. On the screen, the version of me in the chair stirred. My head lifted slowly, my eyes fluttering open. I looked disoriented, confused, as if I didn't know where I was. Then someone stepped into the frame. It was Ms. Grant. She stood over the other me, her expression cold and detached. She said something I couldn't hear, and then she reached into her pocket, pulling out a syringe. I watched, horrified, as she injected the other me with whatever was in the syringe. My body on the screen jerked, and my eyes rolled back in my head. The screen went black. I turned to the thing in front of me, my chest heaving. "What the hell is going on?" Its smile faded, replaced by an expression I can only describe as pity. "You already know," it said. "No, I don't," I shouted, my voice cracking. "What are you talking about?" It stepped closer, and I felt a chill wash over me, like the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. "They're watching you," it said. "They've always been watching." Before I could ask what it meant, the thing started to dissolve. Its body shimmered, breaking apart into a mist of static that dissipated into the air. And then, just like that, it was gone. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty doorway, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My head was spinning, my thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down at the desk. The monitors were normal again, showing the same dull footage of hallways and storage rooms. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like there were eyes on me just out of sight. And then I saw it. A message written in bold letters across the screen of camera 6. "Leave now." I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the room, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. When I reached the main entrance, the guard at the shack didn't even look up as I passed. It was like I didn't exist. I got into my car and drove, the building shrinking in my rearview mirror. I told myself I'd never go back, no matter what the consequences were. But as I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Ms. Grant. "Shift complete. Report back tomorrow at 10 p.m. And attached was a video file. I almost didn't open it. But curiosity got the better of me. The video was grainy, black and white footage of my car. It showed me getting out, walking up to my front door, and turning to look directly at the camera. except I wasn't holding my phone, and I wasn't smiling. I didn't sleep that night. The video replayed in my head over and over, me stepping out of my car, looking straight into a camera I couldn't see, my expression blank, lifeless. That wasn't me. It couldn't have been. By morning, I'd convinced myself not to go back. Breach of contract, penalties, whatever. They could keep their money. But around noon, my phone buzzed again. Another email from Ms. Grant. Failure to report will result in further action. Further action? What did that mean? My stomach churned as I stared at the message. And then, as if to answer my unspoken question, there was a knock at the door. I froze. No one ever came to my house unannounced. My neighborhood wasn't exactly the kind where people drop by to borrow sugar. Slowly I got up and peered through the peephole. A man in a black uniform stood on my porch. He looked like the guards from the facility, stiff, professional, and slightly unnerving. He didn't knock again, just stood there, waiting. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called through the wood. "What do you want?" "You're expected at the facility tonight," he said, his voice flat. "Do not be late." My throat felt dry. "I'm not coming back." He didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was sharp, like he was reciting a line from memory. "Failure to comply will escalate the situation." And just like that, he turned and walked away. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, I was back at the facility. I wish I could say I went out of curiosity or to get answers, but the truth is I was scared. Scared of what they'd do if I didn't show up. The guard at the gate waved me through without a word, and Ms. Grant was waiting for me in the lobby. "Follow me," she said, her voice colder than ever. This time, she didn't take me to the same room. We walked deeper into the building, down hallways I hadn't seen before. The air grew colder, and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights was replaced by an eerie silence. Finally, we stopped in front of a door. It was different from the others, heavier, reinforced, with a keypad and a biometric scanner. Ms. Grant punched in a code, scanned her hand, and the door unlocked with a loud clunk. "Inside," she said, stepping aside. I hesitated. "What is this?" Her eyes narrowed. "Your new station. Do not leave until your shift is complete." Before I could argue, she opened the door and practically shoved me inside. The door slammed shut behind me, the lock clicking into place. The room was smaller than the first one, with only a single monitor mounted on the wall and a chair bolted to the floor. The air was colder here, damp and stale, and the fluorescent light overhead flickered faintly. I sat down, my heart pounding, and stared at the monitor. It showed a single camera feed, a dimly lit hallway that looked different from the others I'd seen. The walls were rough concrete, the kind you'd find in an underground bunker. For the first hour, nothing happened. The hallway stayed empty, and the silence was deafening. I started to wonder if this was some kind of punishment, like they were testing how long I could sit alone in a freezing room. But then, something appeared on the screen. At first, it was just a shadow, flickering at the edge of the frame. I leaned closer, squinting at the monitor. The shadow grew, stretching unnaturally until it formed the shape of a person, a tall, thin figure with elongated limbs. It didn't move like a person, though. It swayed, its body jerking in short, unnatural bursts, like a glitch in a video game. And then it stopped, turning to face the camera. Its face, or what should have been its face, was blank, featureless, just smooth skin stretched over a skull. I couldn't look away. The figure stood there, motionless, as if it were staring back at me. Then slowly it raised one hand and pointed directly at the camera. The monitor flickered, and suddenly the feed changed. It wasn't the hallway anymore, it was the room I was in. The camera was positioned in the corner, showing me sitting in the chair, staring at the monitor. My stomach churned as I realized the figure was no longer on the screen. It was standing behind me. I spun around, gripping the edge of the chair for balance. The room was empty, but I knew it wasn't. The air felt heavier, pressing down on my chest, and I could feel something watching me. I turned back to the monitor, and my blood ran cold. The figure was still there, but now it was standing closer. It was in the corner of the room, just out of my peripheral vision. I didn't dare move. The figure took a step forward, then another, its jerky movements more pronounced now. My reflection on the monitor didn't match my actual movements. I was still sitting, staring, frozen in fear, but the version of me on the screen was smiling. The figure stopped just behind my reflection, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the screen went black. The door behind me unlocked with a sharp click. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The hallway outside was darker now, the lights flickering sporadically. I didn't know where I was going, just away from whatever was in that room. I turned a corner and came face to face with Ms. Grant. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were colder than ever. "Your shift is over," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "What was that?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What's in there?" She didn't answer. Instead, she handed me a folded piece of paper. "Take this and leave. You'll be contacted if we need you again." I unfolded the paper as she walked away. It was a photo, grainy, black and white, like a still from one of the monitors. It showed me sitting in the chair. But the figure wasn't behind me anymore. It was sitting in the chair, and I was nowhere to be seen. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The streets were empty, lit only by dim streetlights, and every shadow seemed to stretch too far, reaching for me. I kept glancing at the photo Ms. Grant had given me, now crumpled in the passenger seat. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window, turned on every light in the house, and sat on the couch with the fire poker from my fireplace. I hadn't slept in days, but the thought of closing my eyes was more terrifying than staying awake. That's when my phone buzzed. A video file. No sender, no subject. Just a single attachment. My chest tightened as I opened it. The footage was shaky, like it was filmed on a hidden camera, but the setting was unmistakable. It was my house, my living room. It showed me sitting on the couch, holding the fire poker, exactly as I was now. But then the me on the screen stood up. Slowly, stiffly, like a puppet being lifted by invisible strings. I didn't move. My grip on the fire poker tightened as I watched myself on the screen. The version of me in the video turned to face the camera. Its expression was blank, its eyes empty, its face twisted into a smile that didn't belong on me. And then it spoke. "You can't run anymore." The voice wasn't mine. It was layered, distorted, as if multiple people were speaking at once. The video ended, but before I could even process what I'd just seen, my phone buzzed again. Another email. "Report back immediately." No explanation, no instructions, just those 3 words. I don't know why I went back. Maybe I wanted answers, or maybe I was just too scared of what would happen if I didn't. The facility was darker this time. The guard shack was empty, and the main entrance was wide open, the fluorescent lights inside flickering wildly. I stepped into the lobby, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was heavier now, colder, and every fibre of my being screamed at me to turn around and leave. But something pulled me forward. The hallways stretched endlessly, their shadows twisting and shifting like they were alive. The doors were all open now, revealing rooms filled with monitors, each one playing the same looping footage of me. In some of the videos, I was sitting at a desk. In others, I was pacing, staring blankly at the camera, or even standing perfectly still as if waiting for something. At the end of the hallway, I found another door. It wasn't like the others. This one was older, made of rusted steel, with no handle or keypad. As I approached, it creaked open on its own. The room beyond was pitch black, but I could feel something inside. A presence, watching, waiting. I stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind me. The lights flickered on, revealing a single monitor in the center of the room. It was larger than the others, its screen glowing with static. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The static began to clear, and an image appeared, a live feed of the room I was standing in. On the screen, I saw myself, but I wasn't alone. Behind me stood the figure, its tall, thin frame looming in the shadows. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its featureless face seemed to twist and writhe, as if trying to form an expression. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the monitor, the figure was closer. It raised a hand, pointing at me through the screen. And then the room went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke up, I was back in my car. It was parked in my driveway, the engine off, the keys in the ignition. I stumbled inside, my head pounding, and collapsed on the couch. My phone buzzed, and I hesitated before picking it up. It was another video file. This time, the footage wasn't of me. It was of Ms. Grant, sitting in a dimly lit room, staring directly into the camera. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her voice was barely a whisper as she spoke. "They're watching," she said. "They're always watching. And now they've seen you." The video ended abruptly, leaving me in silence. I haven't gone back to the facility. I don't even know if it still exists, but every night I feel like I'm being watched. And sometimes, when I pass by a mirror, I see it. The figure standing behind me, waiting. And it's smiling. I was hired by the government to guard a secure package. The package just whispered my name, and I should have known something was off from the start. When a job offer sounds too good to be true, it usually is. But at the time, I wasn't thinking straight. Bills were piling up, my landlord was on my back, and the thought of spending another month on instant noodles and dollar store coffee made me desperate. I found the listing on one of those obscure job boards, nothing fancy, just a plain text ad with a title that read, "Night security needed for confidential government project, $5,000 per week." No experience required, no questions asked. All they needed was discretion and vigilance. I clicked the link without hesitation. The application was weirdly short, just a name, email, and phone number. No background check, no references, nothing. I filled it out and hit submit, half convinced it was a scam. But the next day, I got a call. The guy on the other end sounded like he'd just stepped out of a spy movie. Deep voice, calm, professional. "This is Mr. Grant," he said. "Are you available for an interview?" That's how it started. The interview wasn't what I expected. They didn't ask about my work history or skills. Instead, they drilled me on how well I could follow orders. They wanted to know if I could stay in one place for hours without asking questions, if I could keep my mouth shut, and if I could handle unusual situations. I said yes to everything. They didn't tell me much, just that the job involved guarding a highly sensitive package at an undisclosed location. The pay was insane, so I didn't press for details. A few hours later, I got an email with a time and address. When I arrived, it was clear this wasn't your average security gig. The place was an old, nondescript warehouse on the edge of town, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Two guys in black suits met me at the gate. They didn't introduce themselves, and they didn't seem interested in small talk. Inside, the air was cold and smelled like metal and bleach. The warehouse was mostly empty, except for a single room in the center, sealed off with a heavy steel door. That's where they brought me. "This is your station," one of the men said, motioning toward a desk just outside the door. On the desk was a monitor hooked up to a security feed, showing 4 angles of the room behind the steel door. The room itself was bare, except for a single, large crate sitting in the center. The crate was bolted shut and wrapped in thick chains like something out of a horror movie. "What's in there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man gave me a look that shut me up immediately. "Your job is to stay here," he said. "You don't open the door, you don't touch the package, you don't leave until your shift is over." "And if something happens?" I asked. "Call this number." He handed me a burner phone and walked out without another word. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful. I sat at the desk, staring at the monitor, trying to keep myself awake. The crate didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there. Around midnight, though, things started to feel off. The temperature in the warehouse dropped, and I could see my breath clouding in the air. The lights flickered a couple of times, but I chalked it up to old wiring, and then the monitor glitched. It wasn't like the usual static you get with old cameras. This was different. The screen went black for a second, and when the feed came back, the angles were wrong. The crate was still in the center of the room, but it looked closer, like the cameras had zoomed in, even though I hadn't touched anything. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed something else. The chains around the crate were moving. Just a little, like they were being tugged from the inside. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the ventilation had kicked on, or maybe I was just imagining things. But the longer I watched, the more it looked like something was shifting in the crate. And then I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost too quiet to notice. A whisper. My name. I froze. It wasn't coming from the monitor. It was coming from the door behind me. I spun around, my chair scraping against the floor. The steel door was still shut, the heavy bolts in place. But the sound was unmistakable, soft, raspy, and deliberate. "Evan!" My heart was hammering in my chest. I grabbed the burner phone and dialed the number they'd given me. It rang twice before Mr. Grant's calm voice answered. "Is there a problem?" he asked, like he'd been expecting the call. "The package," I stammered. It's moving, and I heard—" "Stay where you are," he interrupted. "Do not approach the door. Do not engage. We'll send a team." The line went dead. I stared at the door, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just my name anymore. It was phrases, disjointed and broken like a bad signal on a radio. "Help! Trapped! Let me out!" I knew I should have stayed put, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer to the door, pressing my ear against the cold steel. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a deep, guttural growl. I stumbled back, my legs shaking. Whatever was in that crate wasn't human. And I wasn't sure if the team Mr. Grant was sending would be enough to stop it. The whispers didn't stop after that first night. If anything, they got worse. Every shift, as soon as the warehouse fell silent, I'd hear it again, soft, persistent, and always just loud enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Evan!" The voice wasn't familiar, but it felt like it knew me. like it had been saying my name for years. It wasn't coming from the monitors or the phone, but from the steel door. It almost felt like it was seeping through the cracks, creeping into the air around me. I told myself it was just my imagination. Stress, lack of sleep, something like that. But I knew that wasn't true. On my third night, something new happened. The monitors started glitching again, but this time it was worse. The screen flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw something. Not the crate, but something standing next to it. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its shape didn't make sense, like it was stretched out, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an impossible angle. When the feed stabilized, it was gone. The crate was back in the middle of the room, chains still wrapped around it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, even though I couldn't see it. I grabbed the phone and called the number again. Mr. Grant answered on the first ring. "Is there an issue?" he asked, his voice calm as ever. "The cameras," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There was something on the feed, something in the room." "Describe it," he said, like this was just another routine call. "I don't know, it was tall and its limbs were—" I stopped, realizing how insane I sounded. It was gone as soon as the screen came back, but I saw it. There was a long pause on the other end. "Stay at your post," he said finally. "Do not leave the desk. We're monitoring the situation." He hung up without another word. That's when the nightmares started. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the warehouse, standing in front of the crate. In the dream, the chains were broken, and the lid was slightly open. I knew I shouldn't look inside, but I couldn't stop myself. My hands would reach out, trembling, and just as I started to lift the lid, I'd wake up drenched in sweat. The next night, things escalated. The temperature in the warehouse dropped so low that I could see frost forming on the edges of the steel door. The lights flickered constantly, and the whispers were louder, clearer. This time they weren't just calling my name, they were speaking in fragmented sentences, overlapping each other like a broken chorus. "Evan, help. It's not safe. They lied." I felt like I was losing my mind. I kept glancing at the cameras, but the crate never moved. The chains didn't budge, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside was waiting for me to slip up. Then, just after midnight, the power cut out completely. The warehouse plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the security monitor's backup battery. I could barely see the outline of the steel door, but I could hear it. The whispers were louder than ever, swirling around me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Let me out!" I stood frozen, clutching the phone, debating whether to call Mr. Grant again. But before I could dial, the door groaned. Not a loud creak, but a soft, ominous shift, like something on the other side was testing it. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. The phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. That's when I noticed something new. The chains on the crate, on the monitor, were moving. Not a lot, just a slight, rhythmic sway, like someone was pulling on them from the inside. I panicked. I bolted to the far end of the warehouse, hiding behind a stack of crates, my eyes glued to the monitor. I told myself I just needed to wait until the power came back on, until the team arrived, until something happened. But as I sat there, shivering in the cold, I realized I wasn't alone. There was a sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing off the walls. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could hear it. Whatever it was moving closer to my hiding spot. "Evan!" The voice wasn't coming from the steel door anymore. It was in the warehouse. With me. I held my breath, pressing myself against the crates, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone again. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. I thought maybe it had gone away. Then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, swinging wildly, but there was nothing there, just empty air. The whispers were gone, the footsteps were gone. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I stumbled back to the desk, desperate for some kind of explanation, some kind of reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. But the monitor was dead, the cameras weren't showing anything, and then the steel door creaked again. This time it wasn't subtle. The bolts groaned loudly, and the door shifted just slightly, like something was pushing against it. The chains on the crate rattled violently on the screen, and for the first time I realized they weren't going to hold. The whisper came again, soft but chilling. "Run." I don't know how long I stood there staring at the steel door. It wasn't just fear keeping me frozen, it was something heavier, like the air in the warehouse had turned into cement. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The door groaned again, louder this time, and I snapped out of it. The burner phone was still on the desk where I'd left it, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick it up. I dialed Mr. Grant's number, my fingers slipping over the buttons. It rang once, twice. Then his voice came on the line. "Report." "The door," I stammered. Something's trying to get out, I can hear it." "Is the door breached?" he asked, his tone so calm it made me want to scream. "Not yet, but Stay at your post. Do not approach the door. Reinforcements are en route." "Reinforcements?" I echoed, my voice rising. "What the hell is in there? I need to know what I'm dealing with." Mr. Grant didn't answer. The line went dead. I slammed the phone down, frustration boiling over. Whatever was going on, it was clear they weren't going to tell me. And if I was being honest, part of me didn't want to know. The monitors flickered back to life then, static, crackling across the screen. When the feed cleared, my stomach dropped. The crate wasn't in the center of the room anymore. It had moved, not far, just a couple of feet, but enough to send a chill down my spine. The chains were taut now, pulled tight like something inside was testing their strength. The cameras hadn't shown anything touching it, but the crate kept shifting, inching closer to the steel door. I leaned closer to the monitor, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the writing. It wasn't there before. On the wall behind the crate, scrawled in dark, jagged letters, was a single word. "Listen." I stumbled back, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The whispers came again, louder now, but still just out of reach, like a voice you hear in a dream, but can't quite understand. "Evan, listen." I wanted to leave. Every fibre of my being wanted to bolt out of that warehouse and never look back. But something kept me there, rooted to the spot. Curiosity, fear, or maybe it was whatever was behind that door, pulling me closer. The lights overhead flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw a shadow pass across the monitors. Not in the room with the crate, in the hallway behind me. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing. Just the faint glow of the emergency lights casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. But the feeling didn't go away. That sense of being watched, of something standing just out of sight, waiting. I picked up the phone again, my hands trembling. This time, I didn't call Mr. Grant. I called the emergency contact number on the sheet they'd given me on my first night. It rang twice before someone picked up. "This is Delta Command," a woman's voice said, brisk and no nonsense. "Identify yourself." I gave her my name and ID number, stumbling over the words. "The package," I said. It's moving. The door is—" "Hold your position," she interrupted. "Backup will arrive in 10 minutes. "I don't think we have 10 minutes, I said, my voice cracking. "The crate is moving on its own. There's writing on the walls and I—" "Do not engage the package," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Stay at your post." The line went dead again. I felt like screaming. They kept telling me to stay put, but they weren't the ones standing next to that door, hearing the whispers, watching the crate inch closer and closer. The monitors flickered again, and my blood ran cold. The writing on the wall had changed. It wasn't just one word anymore. Now there were 3. Don't trust them. The lights in the warehouse dimmed, and the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in shallow puffs, visible in the icy air. The door groaned again, louder this time, and I heard it, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was laughter, not human laughter. It was too deep, too guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together. It echoed through the warehouse, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and pointed it at the steel door. It looked the same, heavy, bolted, unyielding, but the sound was coming from behind it. Whatever was in that crate wasn't just trying to get out. It was enjoying itself. My legs felt like jelly as I stepped closer, the beam of the flashlight shaking wildly in my hands. I knew I shouldn't go near it, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what was happening. As I got closer, the whispers became clearer, forming actual words. "Evan, they're lying. You're not safe." I was just a few feet from the door when it happened. The crate slammed against the steel with a force that shook the entire warehouse. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The laughter turned into a roar, low and rumbling, vibrating through my chest. And then the voice spoke again, louder this time. "Evan, run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted back to the desk, grabbing the phone and my keys. I didn't care about the job or the money anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I reached the exit, I glanced back at the monitors one last time. The crate was still there, but the writing on the wall had changed again. "You can't escape." The steel door groaned, and I heard the sound of chains snapping. The moment I heard the chain snap, my instincts kicked in. I bolted for the warehouse door, fumbling with the keys in my hand, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The heavy echo of those chains rattling against the steel walls followed me like a warning. Whatever had been locked up wasn't locked anymore. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't get the key into the lock. Behind me, the warehouse felt alive. The whispers, the growls, the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor, they all filled the air, growing louder with every second. And then it stopped. The silence hit me like a punch to the gut. No whispers, no footsteps, nothing but the faint hum of the emergency lights overhead. My hand froze on the key, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I turned around, unable to stop myself. The steel door was wide open, the crate was gone. The monitors on the desk flickered again, static, crackling across the screens. When the image returned, I saw it. Something moving in the room where the crate had been. The camera's angle was too wide, too distorted to make out any details, but the movement wasn't random. It was slow, deliberate, and heading straight for the door. For me. I forced the key into the lock, twisting it until the mechanism clicked. The heavy warehouse door creaked as I pushed it open, the cold night air rushing in. I stepped outside, half expecting something to grab me from behind, but nothing happened. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the pale glow of a flickering streetlight. For a brief, fleeting moment I thought I was safe. Then my phone buzzed. I nearly dropped it in my rush to check the screen. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize. Just 2 words. Too late. I looked back at the warehouse. The steel door was still open, the interior swallowed by darkness. I didn't want to go back in, but something in the air made me hesitate. It wasn't just fear, it was that same heavy pull I'd felt all week. Like whatever was inside that crate wasn't done with me yet. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the same number. Come back. The lights in the parking lot flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw something. Just a shadow, long and twisted, stretching out across the asphalt. It didn't move like a person. It moved like smoke, curling and shifting, vanishing before I could focus on it. I ran to my car, throwing the door open and diving inside. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I slammed the car into gear, peeling out of the lot like a maniac. But the further I drove, the worse it got. The whispers followed me. They weren't coming from the warehouse anymore. They were in the car, wrapping around me, filling my head. The static from the radio crackled even though it was turned off, faint voices slipping through the interference. "Evan, you can't run. It's with you now." I glanced in the rearview mirror and my stomach dropped. There was something in the back seat. It wasn't a person. It was just a shape, dark, shifting, almost liquid, like it was struggling to hold itself together. 2 pinpricks of light shone where its eyes should have been, staring at me through the mirror. I swerved, nearly running off the road. When I looked again, the back seat was empty, but I knew it was still there. I could feel it. I pulled over on the side of the road, my chest heaving, my vision swimming. I fumbled with the phone, dialing the only number I could think of. Mr. Grant answered on the first ring. "Evan," he said, his voice calm as ever. "What's your status?" "It's out," I said, barely able to get the words out. "The crate, the door, it's gone. And it's following me. What the hell did you people put in there?" There was a long pause on the other end. When he spoke again, his tone was colder than I'd ever heard it. "You need to return to the facility." "What?" I shouted. "Are you insane? I'm not going back there." "You don't have a choice," he said. "The package is linked to you now. If you run, it will follow, and if it reaches the wrong place..." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. "You knew this would happen," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You knew and you didn't say anything." "It was a calculated risk," he said. "We'll debrief you when you return. For now, stay in motion. Don't let it settle." "Settle?" I echoed, but the line went dead. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat, my head spinning. "Stay in motion. Don't let it settle." What the hell did that even mean? And why did it feel like no matter what I did, I was already screwed? The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, filling the car with a low, droning hum. The streetlights overhead flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows across the pavement. And then I heard it. The voice. "Evan, come back." It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was right outside the car. The voice outside my car wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The way it spoke my name, slow, deliberate, sent chills racing up my spine. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to look, but something inside me, curiosity, fear, or maybe just some sick instinct, forced me to glance out the window. There was nothing there, just the empty road stretching into the darkness. But then I saw it. In the faint glow of the flickering streetlight, something moved. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, a shadow with no defined shape, like smoke caught in a strong wind. It pulsed and shifted as it came closer, the air around it growing colder. The whispers inside the car grew louder, merging into a single, steady hum, drowning out the sound of my own breathing. "Evan, come back!" I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the asphalt as the car lurched forward, the engine roaring. The shadow didn't chase me. It didn't have to. It was everywhere, bleeding into the corners of my vision, stretching out across the road ahead. No matter how fast I went, I couldn't outrun it. The dashboard lights flickered, the radio crackled to life, and through the static, I heard Mr. Grant's voice. "Keep driving," he said, his tone sharp, commanding. "You're close. Don't stop, no matter what you see." "Close to what?" I shouted, gripping the wheel as the car swerved around a curve. "The extraction point," he said. "We can contain it, but only if you get there. Stay focused." The line went dead again, and I cursed under my breath. The extraction point. That's what they were calling it now, like this was all part of some calculated plan. I didn't know where I was going, but I kept driving. The road ahead, a blur of darkness and shifting shadows. The whispers changed as I drove. They weren't calling my name anymore. They were pleading, begging. "Evan, don't leave. Help us." I shook my head, trying to block them out. They weren't real. They couldn't be real. But the longer I listened, the more familiar they sounded. Not just one voice, but many. Voices I knew, my family, my friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. And then I heard my own voice. "Evan, please." I slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the empty road. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The whispers stopped, and for a moment the world was silent. Then the shadow appeared in front of the car. It wasn't a shape anymore. It wasn't even a thing. It was everything, the darkness, the whispers, the cold. It stretched across the road, blotting out the faint glow of the streetlights, wrapping around the car like a cocoon. And then it spoke again, louder this time. "Evan, come back, or we'll take you." The engine sputtered and died, the lights on the dashboard flickering out. I tried the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. The air inside grew heavy, suffocating, as the shadow pressed closer, filling the windows, seeping into every crack and crevice. I grabbed the phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed Mr. Grant's number one last time. "Answer," I whispered. "Please answer." The line clicked, and his voice came through, calm as always. "You've reached the extraction point." "What do I do?" I shouted. "It's here! It's everywhere! What do I do?" There was a long pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Open the door." "What?" I froze, the phone pressed to my ear. "You need to let it in," he said. "It won't stop until you do." "That's insane!" I shouted. "You told me not to engage it." "This is the only way," he said. "Open the door, now." The shadow outside pulsed, its whispers turning into a low, guttural growl. I didn't know what to believe anymore. My mind was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do anything but what Mr. Grant was telling me. But deep down, I knew he was right. My hand moved on its own, reaching for the door handle. The metal was ice cold under my fingers, and the moment I touched it, the whispers stopped. The shadow outside froze, its form coiling like a predator ready to strike. I pulled the door open. The shadow surged forward, a tidal wave of darkness flooding the car. It didn't feel like smoke or mist. It felt like something alive, something ancient, wrapping around me, pressing into my skin. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was filled with a single, overwhelming thought. You brought this on yourself. Then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed. The room was bright, sterile, and silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor next to me. My head was pounding, my body aching like I'd been hit by a truck. A man in a suit stood at the foot of my bed. "Mr. Grant." "You did well," he said, his tone as emotionless as ever. Happened? I croaked, my throat dry. The package has been contained, he said. Thanks to you. I stared at him, my mind racing. Contained, that's all he cared about. Not the terror I'd been through, not the lives that might have been lost. Just the package. What was it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he placed a folder on the table next to me. Your payment has been deposited. The terms of your agreement prohibit you from discussing this with anyone. Do you understand? I nodded, too tired to argue. Mr. Grant turned to leave, but before he walked out the door, he paused. One more thing, he said, glancing back at me. If you hear whispers again, don't answer them. I never saw him again after that. It's been weeks since the incident, and I haven't heard the whispers since. But sometimes, late at night, I'll see something. A shadow moving in the corner of my room, a faint flicker on the edge of my vision. And every now and then I'll wake up to find a single word scrawled on the mirror in my bathroom. Listen,